April 30th, 1945. Berlin, once the proud capital of the Third Reich, now lies in ruins. The Red Army surrounds the city from all sides, artillery shaking the earth itself. Underground, deep inside the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler finally understands the truth. His empire is dead. Escape routes remain. Japan, Argentina, and even the Middle East. But he refuses. He will not flee. He will fall with Berlin. The final battle of a collapsing empire begins. A city on the edge. Berlin was a city on the brink. Before the war, more than 4.3 million people lived there. By 1945, that number had fallen to around 3 million, with countless families torn apart and entire neighborhoods emptied by death, conscription, or evacuation. Those who remained spent much of their lives in air raid shelters, listening to the thunder of British and American bombs collapsing the world above them. Yet despite the constant terror from the skies, Berliners feared something far worse: the approaching Soviet army. On the walls of bomb shelters, grim warnings were scratched into the concrete. Learn Russian quickly. Everyone knew what the Red Army had endured in the East and what revenge they might seek when they reached the German capital. Joseph Goebbels did everything in his power to keep morale from breaking completely. His propaganda machine celebrated every German counterattack, especially after the Ardennes offensive, when he claimed victory was still within reach. For a brief moment, some dared to hope. But anyone paying attention could see the truth. Berlin was crumbling, and the storm from the east was coming fast. The city stood on the edge of total collapse, and the end was no longer a distant threat, but a countdown already underway. Intelligence ignored. Germany's high command was not blind to the danger approaching from the east. Senior military leaders like General Heinz Guderian, Chief of the General Staff, and Reinhard Gehlen, head of Eastern Front Intelligence, repeatedly warned that a massive Soviet assault was imminent. Their intelligence was precise. The Red Army would strike along the Vistula River line, and it would happen within weeks. Every report pointed to an overwhelming enemy force, preparing to break into the heart of Germany. But Hitler refused to believe any of it. Supported by Heinrich Himmler, who insisted the Soviet threat was exaggerated or even a bluff, Hitler dismissed the warnings as defeatist nonsense. In his mind, the German army remained superior in every way, and no amount of numbers could change that. Rather than reinforcing the eastern defenses, Hitler diverted his best units, including crucial panzer divisions, to Hungary in a desperate attempt to protect the oil fields near Budapest. The results were catastrophic. The Budapest relief operation collapsed. The city fell to the Soviets. And Operation Northwind in the west only further drained Germany's last reserves. With each failure, the Luftwaffe, already battered, was pushed closer to total collapse. By the time Hitler finally realized the Eastern Front was falling apart, the Soviets were advancing faster than anyone had believed possible. The chance to protect Berlin had been thrown away, and the city was now wide open for the coming storm. Soviet juggernaut rolls west. The Red Army that rolled toward Germany in early 1945 was unlike anything the world had ever seen. More than 2.5 million Soviet soldiers were massed along the Eastern Front, backed by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. It was a force fueled not only by numbers and firepower, but by rage. The memory of burned villages, murdered families, and 4 years of unimaginable suffering under Nazi occupation. Their march toward Berlin was not just a military advance. It was a mission of vengeance. In comparison, the German defenses were a hollow shell of their former strength. Around 1 million troops stood between the Soviets and the German capital, but many were exhausted, under-equipped, or barely trained. With fuel shortages crippling armored units and the Luftwaffe nearly grounded, Germany no longer held the ability to strike back with any real force. Even the most loyal generals could not deny reality. They were facing the largest offensive in history with almost nothing left to give. Soviet morale soared as victory finally seemed within reach. Their commanders moved with speed and precision, exploiting every weakness in the German line. What Hitler had once dreamed of achieving, a rapid, unstoppable conquest, was now being delivered upon him by his greatest enemy. With every mile the Red Army advanced, the fate of Berlin became clearer. The juggernaut could not be stopped. Children and the fanatics. As the Red Army drew closer to Berlin, Germany's military machine had all but collapsed. What remained was a desperate patchwork of defenders, scraped together by propaganda and fear. Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi leadership mobilized tens of thousands of ordinary civilians through the Volkssturm. Elderly men, wounded veterans, factory workers, and even women who had never fired a rifle before. Many were issued just a handful of bullets, sometimes no more than 5, and sent to fight against tanks. Among them were boys from the Hitler Youth, some barely 14 years old. Raised on loyalty and fanaticism, they believed they were defending the fatherland's final hope. They launched suicidal attacks with panzerfausts, taking aim at Soviet armor from basements and alleyways. Their courage was real, but so was the futility. Against a force as large as the Red Army, their sacrifices achieved little more than delaying the inevitable. Fighting alongside these makeshift militias were the hardened remnants of the Waffen-SS, still fiercely loyal to Hitler. They clung to the idea that one last miracle could save the Reich, refusing to surrender even when surrounded. Hitler, still deep within his bunker, raged about betrayal and cowardice, insisting that Berlin would become a fortress and that the enemy would bleed to death on its streets. But even the most fanatical defenders could not disguise the truth. Berlin's army had become a symbol of the regime itself, broken, delusional, and willing to sacrifice its youngest and weakest for a lost cause. The final battle would be fought not by an elite force, but by a city of the desperate. Vistula Oder offensive. The final Soviet push toward Berlin began long before their troops reached the German border. At dawn on January 12, 1945, under heavy snowfall, the Red Army launched a massive assault along the Vistula River in Poland. Before the first tank even moved, Soviet sappers had already crept across no man's land in the dark, clearing minefields and preparing paths for the armored divisions waiting behind them. Then, as the sun began to rise, artillery fire shook the earth. Thousands of guns opened up in a thunderous barrage that shattered German defenses in minutes. To make matters worse for the Germans, Hitler himself ensured disaster. He had ordered panzer reserves forward into exposed positions, placing them directly in the blast zone of Soviet artillery. When the offensive began, many of these tanks were destroyed before they could even engage the enemy. The German commanders in the field could only watch as their last armored hope was obliterated. What followed was a stunning display of speed and precision. Soviet troops surged forward at a pace that shocked even their own leadership. Entire German units vanished under the weight of the attack, and defensive lines that once seemed strong simply crumbled. In just 2 weeks, the Red Army captured nearly all of Poland and closed to within 69 kilometers, just 43 miles, of Berlin. The once proud Vistula Line, the shield of the Eastern Front, had fallen almost overnight, but the Soviets did not push directly into Berlin, at least not yet. A German counterattack in Pomerania threatened their northern flank, and Soviet commanders temporarily paused their advance to secure their positions. It was a brief delay, but one that offered no real relief to Germany. Time was running out, and everyone inside Berlin knew what came next: the showdown for the capital of the collapsing Reich, the race to Berlin. By April 1945, the path to Berlin was wide open, but the Soviet High Command did not view the upcoming assault as a simple march to victory. It became a competition. Stalin divided the advance among three massive fronts, led by Marshals Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky, each eager to be the one who captured Hitler's capital and earned a place in history. The dictator encouraged this rivalry, knowing that ambition could be a powerful motivator. Berlin was not just a military prize, it was a symbol of triumph over fascism. The assault began on April 16th at the Seelow Heights, the last major defensive line before Berlin itself. Nearly 1 million Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, opened fire in a barrage so intense that it lit the night sky like a man-made sunrise. The German forces defending the heights were outnumbered and exhausted, but they fought ferociously, determined to protect the city behind them. Soviet losses were heavy, but Zhukov could not afford to slow down. Not while Konev's forces were advancing rapidly from the south, threatening to reach Berlin first. 4 days later, the German defenses buckled, and Soviet troops began pouring through the gaps. As the Red Army advanced, Berlin's fate was sealed. On April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, Stalin sent him a grim gift, a relentless artillery bombardment that thundered across the capital without pause. By April 22nd, the city was completely cut off from the outside world. German leadership, still clinging to fantasy, ordered the 9th and 12th Armies to link up and break the encirclement. But these orders were detached from reality. There was no rescue coming. The race was over. The Soviets had reached their goal, and now only the brutal fight inside the city remained. Berlin. Hell on earth. Berlin descended into chaos as the Red Army breached the outskirts of the city. What had once been the proud heart of the Nazi Empire was now a landscape of shattered buildings, burning rubble, and terrified civilians. The front line wasn't a distant horizon anymore. It was every street corner, every apartment block, every staircase. Warfare had come home. German defenders turned the capital into a maze of death. Snipers hid high in bombed-out rooftops. Machine gun teams waited behind barricaded windows. Panzerfausts, handheld tank killers, lurked in basements, ready to fire at Soviet armor point blank. For Soviet soldiers, every step forward risked an ambush. Urban fighting became brutally intimate. Battles fought at arm's length, room to room, floor by floor. For civilians, there was no escape. Food had nearly run out. Water lines were shattered. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, while countless more suffered unseen in the darkness of basements. Every explosion shook the ground like an earthquake. Every night, the firestorms glowed red against the clouds. With every block lost, the defenders were pushed closer toward the center. The final battleground of the Reich was shrinking fast, and the Soviets were closing in. Reichstag under siege. By the end of April, the Soviets had driven the German defenders back to the symbolic heart of Berlin, the area surrounding the Reichstag. Once the seat of German democracy, the building had been a hollow political trophy ever since the Nazis seized power. Now, in the final days of the war, it became the ultimate objective. For Soviet soldiers, raising their flag over the Reichstag would mark the triumph of their long and brutal struggle. For the Germans, losing it meant accepting the end. The approaches to the building were transformed into a fortress of desperation. Networks of trenches, bunkers, and makeshift barricades lined the streets. Machine guns were positioned behind every opening. Moats of rubble blocked tanks. The remaining defenders, a mix of SS troops, Volkssturm fighters, and Hitler Youth, made their stand with the conviction that even a few hours' delay was worthwhile. On April 30th, the Soviets launched their assault. Waves of infantry rushed forward under withering fire. Many fell before they reached the outer walls, victims of snipers or concealed artillery pieces. But the Red Army pressed on, tightening their grip with every advance. When they finally breached the building, the battle erupted into a storm of grenades, close-quarters gunfights, and hand-to-hand combat in dark, smoke-filled corridors. Collapse of leadership. As the Soviets closed in around him, Adolf Hitler retreated further into denial. Deep beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, inside the dim and claustrophobic Führerbunker, the man who once imagined a 1,000-year empire now ranted about betrayal and cowardice. He blamed the German people for failing him, even as those people continued to die for a war already lost. Reports of Soviet breakthroughs reached him constantly, each one erasing the last illusion of salvation. With the Reich reduced to a few city blocks, Hitler finally accepted what he had long refused to admit. There would be no victory and there would be no escape. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler ended his life alongside Eva Braun, choosing death over surrender. With their bodies hastily burned in the bunker courtyard, the dictatorship effectively died with them. Above ground, the situation unraveled even faster. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz attempted to assume leadership in northern Germany, but his influence could not reach the ruined capital. The last commander of Berlin's defense, General Helmuth Weidling, understood that continued resistance meant only needless bloodshed. He urged surrender, but one final obstacle stood in his way: Joseph Goebbels. The fall of Berlin marked the end of the war in Europe. Within a week, Germany signed an unconditional surrender, and May 8, 1945, became known as Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. But victory came at a massive cost. The Soviets suffered devastating losses in the final assault, while Berlin, once the center of Nazi ambition, had been reduced to ashes. Millions of civilians were dead or displaced, and the city stood as a haunting monument to the consequences of tyranny. The Battle of Berlin closed the final chapter of Hitler's war. It was a symbol of total triumph for the Allies and total destruction for the Reich that once claimed domination over the world. The empire built on conquest and fear ended exactly as it had ruled, in violence, ruin, and despair. Empires rise with ambition, but they fall when fear and delusion take command.